Not really a subject I've ever come close to discussing, but is in fact the main motivator for my beginning this channel. Depression. Also the main reason for my lack of activity over the last couple of years. It is a bit of a difficult subject to broach, and even now I'm having doubts as to whether or not to discuss the topic, and more specifically how the topic applies to me, or at least how it affects and has affected me. For me, the purpose of this video is to communicate to the wider world something that has been, for the most part, a secret to all but those very few I feel closest to. And I suppose the purpose for communicating in any place this is threefold. First, to exercise some of my own personal problems in a bid to acknowledge things and to move on. Second, as a means of reaching out to those whose lives are affected similarly to mine, with the aim of helping them, even in some small way. Third, to spread awareness among those that don't have or are not familiar with how profoundly psychological, emotional problems affect people. On quite a number of occasions, people have sent me emails, and a lot more frequently left comments to say how I've put words to something they felt but couldn't quite express. Almost as often I've been told that I've highlighted an issue they've been somewhat aware of, but discussed the subject in such a way that it gave them a new or deeper understanding. Or just that I've made a single comment that made them think about something in a totally different way. None of these things were my intent previously, but this time round it is my quiet yet audible hope that it does. Without giving you a life story, a little personal background would be helpful. From my early teens I've suffered with some level of psychological disturbance, which ebbed and flowed over time. A lot of my problems have their roots in my early life, particularly my teens. On reflection, I have suffered with depression since my mid-teens, though I have only just come to realize it myself over the last few months. My childhood years were not unhappy. In fact, they were very pleasant, but they were frustrated, and it was these underlying frustrations that founded the fertile ground for the later, more pronounced issues. I don't know how typical this pattern is, but in my case, causes of mental issues didn't spring out of the ground overnight. They were the result of prolonged exposure to bad stuff. Granted, some are more prone to varying degrees of mental issues. My own family is particularly strewn with psychological issues of one kind or another. In my own situation, my frustrations were not actually acknowledged at the time, on a conscious level at least, but impacted me nonetheless. Without going into details, my upbringing was less than typical, and I joined in with nothing that a typical child could expect to do. This was by design of my upbringing, and was explicitly forbidden by the religious order my parents are members of. I have in fact never celebrated my own birthday, along with a great number of other things people take for granted. This isolationist theology was also the root of perhaps nearly all the majority of my early life frustrations. Things like not being able to date who I wanted to, at least not publicly. Being told to reject all education beyond the legal minimum, even who could and could not be my friends. I would posit that this setup would be a problem enough, but it actually didn't feel bad growing up. It was simply my reality. A weird one, but one I was conditioned from birth to accept. Recently, I've had quite a lot of psychological assistance and assessments, along with supervised IQ tests. The assessment showed, I'm proud to say, that I fall within the highest 98th percentile of the population in terms of intellectual capacity. For those that are curious or care, my IQ falls somewhere between 138 and 148. This was actually really important to me, because it confirmed something that I'd long suspected. Not only was I bright, but I was brighter than most people. It sounds conceited to say, but being bright enough to be considered gifted is somewhat of a poisoned chalice for me. My upbringing gave me no satisfying outlet for my abilities, and was in fact designed to actively suppress them. This was another major frustration that silently ate at me. I realized at the time that intellect was a factor of my frustrations, but how exactly or to what level escaped me. In hindsight, the main problem was being surrounded not only by people that weren't very bright, but people who lacked logical, rational minds, and they were ignorant. really ignorant. And for me, this was a bigger factor for deep-seated frustrations than not having the freedom to date or befriend who I wanted, or to eat a birthday cake. Though the problems that really took a toll on me didn't come until much later on in life, I don't want this backstory to drag on, so I'll summarise as best I can the rest. In December 2008, my wife became incredibly ill and eventually was admitted to hospital. Being paralysed from the eyes down, she couldn't eat, drink, or talk. The cause is still unknown, but this was the darkest part of my life. I seriously doubted at one point whether or not she would get through, and for a time, silently believed that she would die. Happily, she didn't, but she never got back to full strength, and still can't walk, and needs daily help. In 2009, I distanced myself from the religious order my family indoctrinated me into. My reasons for doing so were evidential in nature, contradictions between established facts and theological interpretations of the world and its history, which, in turn, unravelled the entire theological underpinnings of the order. Distancing myself set in effect a series of events, from incessant pestering from the local leadership to friends and family creating space between us. Close relatives got married, invited my siblings, but not me. Friends had parties, I wasn't told. A friend even died and was buried, but I wasn't told about the funeral. The order has a notorious reputation for aggressively excommunicating its members, and I have luckily escaped the very worst of it, but not all of it. De facto member, and so current members, such as my parents and siblings, feel they have a choice as to whether or not they can have something to do with me. I know too many people who feel the full sting of total excommunication every single day of their lives. Also in 2009, my business partner, with whom I had set up an online tool retailer selling specialist tools, chose to steal all of the company's proceeds and, adding insult to injury, lied several times about it. This was obviously the end of the business. So I found myself with no work or money, no friends, and conspicuous silence from particular family members, and my wife chronically incapacitated and suffering daily seizures and constant pain. You may expect that this was the point when I suffered some kind of mental breakdown, but I didn't. In fact, as much of a dark time as it was, it didn't feel all that terrible. This was a key point in my life, do or die moment, and thankfully I did. I had already started to teach myself how to code, and so I knew enough to get by. I set up my own development business from my little dark living room, and went knocking on doors of all the businesses in my local city and surrounding towns. Given that most of the world had entered deep recession at that time, it probably wasn't the opportune time to set up a business, but I made a living eventually. In December 2012, when I started to suffer my first real bouts of painful, debilitating depression, most likely a consequence of years of little to no social contact and little opportunity to make new friends. Things have improved since then, but I've not ever been the same since December 2012, and even now I doubt I will. I have my good days, weeks, months, and my bad days, weeks, months. As I've said, the reason I started this channel was a sort of remedy for negating the mild negative feelings I was having at the time. The internet can be a cruel and offensive place, not in my own experience. And this is an important factor to bear in mind. In some way, I'm taking an emotional risk by speaking so candidly of my own emotional vulnerabilities in such a very public way. But I'm moved to express it because, in my experience, not enough people understand emotional, psychological issues. And I want them to. You most likely know someone who you see daily that suffers with any number of issues. Issues kept entirely secret from me. I know more people than I can count on one hand that have attempted to take their own lives, and sadly, and yet thankfully, an even smaller number that actually succeeded. These events would always come as a revelation to me, from completely out of the blue, or would be revealed to me in a confidential one-to-one. In any case, it was always a shock. For myself, there have been times when the possibility of taking my own life was not far from incarnating itself into action. And who could have guessed? Who could have known? Very, very few. Depression is not caused by weakness. It is caused by staying strong for too long. From fighting against an invisible and pervasive blanket of bad every day. There, waking in the morning, eating at lunch, silently looking out of the window, going to sleep, and throughout your dreams. More people than you'd guess struggle with demons you never knew existed. That is the importance of being kind and forgiving, open, honest, and supportive. You have no idea whose life you've just made bearable, whose lifelong gratitude you've engendered by showing some kindness.